Nearly half a century has passed since the last human footprint was pressed into the lunar dust, long enough for the memory of that moment, once so electric, so unimaginable, to fade from the headlines and settle into history books. But for those who lived through it, it remains vivid, a time when the entire planet seemed to hold its breath, watching one man descend onto a world not our own. That world, cold, distant, and silent, was supposed to be the beginning. A threshold, not a dead end. Since 1972, no human, American, Russian, or otherwise, has returned to the moon. Not for exploration, not for research, not even for a symbolic gesture. For decades, we've accepted the official reasons. It was too expensive, the Cold War lost its heat, the dream had been fulfilled. But something about those explanations has never felt complete. Because if walking on the moon was truly our greatest achievement, shouldn't the next step have been further? Why then did we turn back? In the silence left behind, theories began to whisper. Stories of strange transmissions, missing footage, conversations that were never aired. Some say we found something up there, something that didn't want us to come back, and maybe we listened. Between 1969 and 1972, humanity achieved what once seemed impossible. 6 missions, 12 astronauts, all touching the surface of another world. The grainy black and white footage of men bouncing across the lunar landscape became symbols of courage and brilliance, a moment when science, imagination, and raw determination aligned. And yet, just as the dream began to unfold, we quietly closed the door. Apollo 17, the last mission to the moon, departed in December of 1972, and since then, no one has returned, not once. NASA's explanation was simple. The Cold War tensions had eased, national priorities shifted, and the missions were too costly. The Apollo program, born out of political competition, had served its purpose. The race was over. But for many, that answer felt too convenient, too clean. Because if that moment truly represented the peak of our intelligence and capability, why were the follow-up missions, Apollo 18, 19, and 20, canceled without ceremony? Equipment had been prepared, crews had been trained, trajectories were set. Then, silence. If the moon offered nothing of value, wouldn't that itself be worth confirming with more missions? And if it held secrets, why did we stop asking? As years passed and technology surged forward, the silence surrounding the moon became louder. In its place, something darker took root: rumors, blurred photos, redacted files, snippets of strange transmissions. All painting a very different picture than the one we were shown. Maybe we didn't stop because we were done. Maybe we stopped because something told us to. When Apollo 17 lifted off from the lunar surface on December 14, 1972, it marked more than the end of a mission. It marked the end of an era and the beginning of one of the longest silences in space exploration history. Astronauts Eugene Cernan, Harrison Schmitt, and Ronald Evans returned to Earth hailed as heroes. Their mission was declared a full success. Official reports said nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. But as time passed, a different story began to emerge, one not told in press conferences or mission summaries. Whispers surfaced from unofficial sources, from declassified fragments, anonymous insiders, and even former military personnel. Among the most disturbing accounts was a story posted in 2015 by a British psychologist who claimed to have conducted post-mission debriefings with support crew tied to the Apollo program. According to this anonymous account, something happened in the final hours of Apollo 17's stay on the moon, something the public was never meant to know. The story went like this. After stepping outside the lunar module, the astronauts reportedly encountered a wrecked spacecraft partially hidden behind a low ridge of moon rock. It was clearly not theirs, and inside that wreckage were human remains. Not in NASA suits, not American, but suited in gear that bore eerie resemblance to Soviet cosmonaut designs, yet marked with unfamiliar insignias and torn open in multiple places. Their helmets had been violently shattered, as if something, not decompression or mechanical failure, but something physical had attacked them. Panicked, the astronauts radioed mission control and urgently requested permission to leave. But their request was denied. Technical constraints, they were told, required them to remain on the surface for several more hours. And it was in those hours, the psychologist claimed, that things got worse. Transmissions became increasingly erratic. The crew's voices, once calm and procedural, turned sharp with fear. They described seeing shapes, dark forms, moving silently among the distant lunar ridges. Not approaching, not retreating, but circling, watching. From Earth, the instruction remained, hold position, continue observation, then radio silence. When communication resumed, the feed was sanitized. The final minutes of lunar audio were cut from the public release, and all post-mission interviews focused on rock samples, scientific experiments, and patriotic pride. Not one question, not one, was asked about what they might have seen. Apollo 17 didn't end with closure. It ended like a book ripped shut mid-sentence, its last pages missing, and from that moment on, no one ever returned. As the strange rumors around Apollo 17 continued to grow, a curious detail began surfacing again and again, spoken only in whispers, never in official documents. It suggested that despite the Cold War tension, the United States and the Soviet Union once worked together, not to return to the moon for science, but to investigate. According to several unofficial sources, including the same British psychologist who had shared stories from Apollo 17's debriefings, a covert operation was launched in December of 1990. It was not publicly acknowledged. It did not appear in Roscosmos records because it wasn't conducted by Roscosmos at all. Instead, it came from deep inside a shadowy Russian military division known only as Katsuki, headquartered in a restricted zone in Russia's Far East. The objective: send a small, unmanned lander, possibly even manned, depending on the version, to the exact site where the Apollo 17 crew had allegedly encountered the alien wreckage and the bodies. What happened next was never reported in the news. As the lander descended toward the surface, everything appeared routine. Telemetry was clean. The coordinates matched the intended site. Then audio logs from the crew crackled in. Confirmation. They had visual contact with wreckage, the same wreckage described years earlier, still there, but within minutes everything changed. A sudden burst of static, a scream cut off mid-syllable, sharp, metallic interference followed by silence. Not radio silence, total silence. Seismic sensors left on the moon during earlier missions registered a sudden tremor near the site, as if something had shifted. Then every signal, data, video, audio went dark. At mission control, engineers and military officers stared helplessly at frozen screens. No mayday, no emergency alert, no final words, only a wave of interference that spread across every open frequency for over an hour. Later that night, a secret emergency meeting was called in Moscow. By morning, all mission data had been seized and sealed under military defense codes. No public statements were made. No names were released. And those involved in the operation, they retired quietly or disappeared. There were no funerals, no plaques, just a hole in the story of space exploration where something was removed and never spoken of again. And if this mission truly happened, if even one piece of it was real, then maybe what humanity encountered on the moon wasn't just a mystery. It was a warning. And since that day, perhaps every space agency on Earth has agreed, without a single word spoken, that the moon is no longer a place for us. Space is supposed to be silent, There is no air, no wind, no medium to carry sound. And yet, what the Apollo astronauts heard suggests that space might be far stranger than we were ever told. In May of 1969, during Apollo 10, the mission that rehearsed everything for the first moon landing, except the landing itself, astronauts Eugene Cernan and John Young were drifting in lunar orbit inside the module when they began to hear something unexpected in their headsets. It wasn't static, it wasn't feedback, it was music, a soft, eerie series of whistling tones, rising and falling, drifting like a melody from nowhere. "Did you hear that?" Cernan asked. "It's like someone's playing a flute," Young replied. The sound lasted over an hour before fading. Ground control heard nothing. NASA didn't log it. And for decades, no one outside the mission knew it even happened. It wasn't until 2008, almost 40 years later, when a batch of forgotten mission recordings was declassified, that the public finally heard it. NASA later claimed it was likely interference between VHF radios on board the module, but many weren't convinced, because if it was interference, why had no one heard it before or since? And then came Apollo 15. This time it wasn't sound, it was sight. While surveying the base of Mount Hadley, astronauts David Scott and James Irwin stumbled across something strange in the lunar soil, tracks, not from the lunar rover, not from their own boots. These imprints were spaced evenly, in a perfect line, leading west into empty terrain. But there was a problem. Apollo 15 was the first mission equipped with a rover. Nothing had ever traversed that area before. And the tracks didn't match any known tread pattern from human machinery. They were just there. No explanation was given. No entry made in the official logs. Only brief voice exchanges between the crew, followed by silence and a shift back to scientific objectives. Across multiple missions, strange audio, unexplained visuals, and unidentified signals appeared again and again, and yet none of them were investigated publicly. None were addressed in real time. They simply faded into quiet records, buried beneath decades of silence. Were they anomalies, glitches, hallucinations under stress, or were they the first signs, subtle, confusing, easy to dismiss, that something else was already there? Watching, listening, and perhaps warning us in its own way. On July 20th, 1969, the world held its breath. Families gathered around flickering black and white televisions, watching in awe as Neil Armstrong descended the ladder of the lunar module. Then came the words that would echo through history. "That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind." But what the world never heard was what came next, because shortly after that historic broadcast, Armstrong reportedly switched to a secondary communication channel. One that wasn't meant for the public, one reserved for medical and telemetry data, secure, private, and off the main feed. According to multiple leaked accounts that surfaced years later, it was on this channel that Armstrong described seeing something extraordinary. Metallic structures lined along the edge of a nearby crater. He described them as geometric, unnatural, shaped like buildings with visible entryways that seemed to descend beneath the lunar surface. And near these structures, rows of cylindrical objects, too large to be rocks, too symmetrical to be natural, laid out like parked vehicles, as if someone had been there. When asked by Mission Control if he had completed his scientific tasks, Armstrong answered yes. But he added something strange, something quiet. He expressed concern that they might remove the equipment once the crew left. They, who was they? Years later, researchers who claimed to have spoken with Armstrong in private described him as distant. Guarded, one of them even quoted him as saying softly, "They don't want us there." But the mystery didn't end on the surface. On the way to the moon, before the landing, another incident occurred. Armstrong contacted Houston, asking for confirmation on the location of the Saturn V's third stage booster. 3 minutes later, NASA responded. The the booster was over 6,000 miles behind them. But Armstrong and Aldrin had been observing something, a cylindrical object, glowing faintly at one end, trailing silently beside their craft. It wasn't space debris. It wasn't the booster. It was something else. NASA would later claim it was likely a loose panel from the spacecraft, but Armstrong remained unconvinced. And ever since, the story of that silent, glowing companion object has never fully disappeared. Was it an escort, a watcher, or something far more ancient, something that had seen others come and go before us? If the moon was truly lifeless, barren, and empty, then what was that thing, keeping pace with the most important mission in human history? And why, even now, does no one want to talk about it? In every story about the unknown, there are two kinds of people the world tends to forget. The first are the ones who stood in the shadows, analysts, technicians, engineers, those who processed the data, developed the photographs, and listened to the raw transmissions from deep space. The second are those who saw something or heard something they were never supposed to know. And when these two paths cross, what we find isn't just mystery, it's danger. One of the most well-known names in this shadowy history is Bob Dean, a retired U.S. Army Command Sergeant Major. He was no astronaut. He never set foot on the moon. But according to his own words, during his NATO service in the 1960s, he was granted access to a classified document known only as an assessment. It was, he claimed, a top-secret evaluation of potential extraterrestrial threats compiled by military intelligence. Inside it, photos from the Apollo missions that had never been released. He described strange metallic structures, artificial formations, and clear signs of intelligent activity on the moon. According to Dean, over 40 reels of film were deliberately destroyed by NASA, not for error, not for redundancy, but to erase evidence. He once smiled bitterly and said, "NASA, it should stand for never a straight answer." Bob Dean passed away peacefully in 2018. Just days later, someone else died. But this time, not peacefully. On October 17, 2018, 6 days after Dean's death, a man named Carl Wolf was struck and killed by a reversing tractor while riding his bicycle in a quiet New York town. A tragic accident, the police said, but to those who knew his story, it felt like more. Because Carl Wolf wasn't just anyone. He was a former U.S. Air Force sergeant, and the first person to publicly claim he had seen photographs of alien structures on the far side of the moon. In 1965, while working at Langley Air Force Base, Wolf was called to repair optical equipment used for processing lunar reconnaissance images. During the repair, a fellow technician showed him something he was never supposed to see. A series of photographs showing towers, domes, and mushroom-shaped buildings, all built on the dark side of the moon. Wolf kept silent for over 30 years. Then in 2001, he stepped onto a national stage, speaking at the Disclosure Project press conference alongside dozens of other former military insiders. He told the world everything he had seen, and 17 years later, he was run over by a tractor on a dry road with no security camera footage and no witnesses. Coincidence? Maybe. But two men, two stories, both connected to secrets from the moon and both silenced in the same week. Perhaps they were accidents. Perhaps they were reminders that some truths are only safe as long as they remain hidden. For all of human history, the moon has been a symbol of mystery, romance, and rhythm. Its presence in the sky is so familiar, so constant, that we rarely stop to question it. But what if the moon is not what it appears to be? What if it was never natural at all? This is the core of a chilling theory, one dismissed by mainstream science, yet impossible to fully disprove. Known as the hollow moon hypothesis, it suggests that the moon is not a solid celestial body, but a constructed shell, an artificial structure, perhaps ancient, perhaps alien, perhaps still occupied. It may sound like science fiction, but the evidence is stranger than you'd think. In 1970, during a controlled experiment, NASA deliberately crashed the ascent stage of the Apollo 12 lunar module into the moon's surface to test seismic responses. What they recorded was not what they expected. The moon rang. Seismic instruments registered vibrations echoing for nearly an hour, as if the entire structure reverberated like a giant bell. Not a thud, not a dull impact. A resonance, hollow, metallic, and unnatural. NASA tried to explain it away, blaming the moon's lack of water and unique geological properties. But to those watching closely, it didn't sound like rock. It sounded like metal. Add to that the moon's impossible orbit, perfectly circular, perfectly synchronized so that the same face always looks toward Earth. Statistically, such a phenomenon would be near impossible unless intentionally engineered. And then there's the density. The moon is far lighter than it should be based on its size, another anomaly. Combined with seismic evidence and the countless unexplained phenomena from Apollo missions, it starts to resemble less a natural satellite and more a vessel. A dormant one. Maybe it's a forgotten ark. Maybe it's a station that watches. Maybe it was brought here long ago, not by gods, not by chance, but by something that wanted a front row seat to our evolution. And maybe we were never meant to discover it. Maybe we got too close. The shadows, the wreckage, the missing missions, the silenced voices. It all begins to form a pattern, a message written not in words, but in omission, fear, and silence. The moon, once our greatest dream, now looms like a mirror in the sky. But what exactly is looking back?